Well, Hans, over the last couple of weeks, we've seen all kinds of endorsements for Kamala come out. You've got Dick Cheney and, well, the Cheneys as a family, and these other conservative, so-called conservative people suddenly coming out and saying that they're endorsing Kamala. But there was a rather overlooked endorsement for Kamala that happened a few days back, and that was from Scientific America, a magazine that was involved in the COVID cover-up. And what they noted was for this only the second time in their roughly, I think, what was it, 150-year history, they were endorsing Kamala as president. And that was something that sort of jumped out to the both of us for the oddness of it. And I think what we're really seeing take place is kind of this narrative of the establishment lining up behind Kamala from top to bottom. That you've got all the way from kind of the military industrial complex, the intelligence community, but the Scientific America captures a lot of that because indeed, we think there's a lot of tie-ins to the DoD, to the intelligence community, all of whom work diligently to cover up the COVID, the origin of COVID, and to have them come out. That was kind of the final nail in the coffin as to who is actually backing Kamala and why they're backing Kamala. That Kamala is not going to rock the ship. She's not going to allow, too many questions to be asked, that she's the convenient candidate. As bad as she just needs to be a face that's not going to allow uncomfortable questions to be asked.
Well, or she needs to be the face that is just, the puppet, literally, who's just controlled and won't ever, as you mentioned, rock the boat. But it is very, important to highlight that it's not just Cheney and it's not just Alberto Gonzalez. We should talk a bit more about him as well here. But also people like Scientific American, which, it's a label. It's the name of magazine, 150. Well, it's one of the oldest magazines in America.
I think it was actually 179 years, correcting myself here.
Right. And they're burning their reputation that they gained over 2 centuries, hand over fist because of Trump. But is it just because of Trump? And that's, I think, the key question here. Do we have all these weird endorsements? Again, Cheney, the architect of the Iraq War. It's just almost unreal. Alberto Gonzalez, who is, of course, was George W. Bush's attorney general, who was behind the whole waterboarding. And guess what? He was forced to resign because of political interference in prosecutions, the thing that Democrats purport to hate the most. They keep talking, oh my God, this is so terrible. And now the guy who did all that has endorsed them, and they're like, yay. And, Kamala, of course, be very happy about all these endorsements. But I think, the fact that you mentioned Scientific American is so important because you really then get to the point, with Cheney, Gonzalez, others, you can, or all these former Bush officials and so on, you can say, well, there's sour grapes and they have, issues and so on. It's political or whatever. But Scientific American, but that then brings me back to something that happened in 2020, which is all the COVID origin hoaxers, Peter Daszak and his crew, they were all rooting for Biden in very, very overt ways. And, we have tweets after Biden was supposedly elected, after the media declared that he had been elected, which was on November 7th, 2020. Peter Daszak, who was the guy who was the Fauci's conduit over in the Wuhan lab, he tweeted that they can break out the bottles of champagne now, and he was doing it along with the Wuhan lab. I mean, he was naming those people at the Wuhan lab in his tweet, and you got to wonder what is it that, and of course, Scientific American was also covering up the origin of COVID. What is it about the so-called scientists that makes them all want to endorse Kamala? And I agree with you. I think the overarching theme here, yes, for each of them, you can come up with particular reasons. Like Liz Cheney is pissed off because of what happened with her tenure in the House, and she wants to sort of lash out at MAGA. And for everyone, you can come up with some kind of reason. But there is an overarching kind of umbrella. And it's not just Trump hatred. That would be too simple. I completely agree with you. And I think that's really the theme of what we kind of should dig into here a bit more. It's the fact that they want to keep things concealed. They want to keep things as they are. It's like, it's not just not rock the boat. There's more to it. With COVID origin, is it just about rocking the boat, or is it about more? Well, it's about more. It's about the role that the United States government played in all of this, the intelligence services, Fauci, and so on and so forth. But you can say that about all these other topics as well. Dick Cheney, he's never been held accountable for what happened in Iraq. Alberto Gonzalez, okay, he had to resign. He's never been held accountable. So you had a lot of people who, we haven't even talked about the Russia collusion hoaxers. They're all on Kamala's side. So to me, the overarching point here is that everyone's got something to hide. And the only person who isn't going to bring sunshine, who's going to hide, who's going to help hide, who is part of the whole cabal is, of course, Kamala.
Yeah, and never lose sight of the fact that who led the charge in covering up for Joe Biden's mental decline. There's probably no one that's more culpable in that than Kamala herself. But I see this, it's very convenient to sort of point to this as a right-left and kind of a conservative, liberal realignment. But I see it as a little more complex, and we've been alluding to that this is more an establishment realignment. And that when people talk about saving our democracy and protecting our democracy, what they're really talking about is protecting the status quo. They don't care about democracy in the way that the man on the street thinks about it. They define democracy as the institutions, and that those need to be protected, and the bureaucracy needs to be protected at all costs. And that's why we had this realignment where you had people like Cheney, Gonzalez, etc. List actually, the further you drill down, it's kind of endless. But that those people are realigning in place. And that's what the Scientific American piece or their endorsement really kind of, I think it jumped out to the both of us for exactly that purpose, that it's showing, wait a minute, the second time in the entire history of a nearly 200-year prestigious scientific publication is endorsing Kamala, and just happens to be the one candidate who probably has zero interest in getting to the bottom of not only the COVID origins, but what lies behind that. What other lab leaks may have happened? What other viruses may have escaped out into the world, et cetera, over time? It's basically as if it's an endorsement of Coverup.
And of course, you're absolutely right. But the first time that they ever did this in their 170 whatever odd year history was 4 years ago, Joe Biden.
Yep.
What do you know? Whereas in 2016,
it's convenient how they left that out of their endorsement, right?
2016 they didn't. So it's not simply Trump is bad. 2016 Trump was the worst. The Access Hollywood and this guy who was just this carnival barker and blah blah blah. We all remember those times. I mean, if it was about Trump, they could have easily endorsed Hillary back in 2016. But they didn't do that because there wasn't anything to cover up, or at least not on the science side.
There was no need to do so, right?
But of course, in 2020, it became very clear. By the way, as 2020 unfolded, there was already this battle unfolding. I know we're focusing here on COVID origin, and we'll expand it a bit here in a moment, but I think it's worth focusing on COVID origin just for a moment, just to show how this is about concealment rather than just Trump hatred. In 2020, we've talked about this on the show before, there was an evolving kind of tug of war between basically Trump and Trump alone, maybe Peter Navarro, on his side, and that was about it.
That was about
talking about government, not about people like us on the outside. And kind of everyone else, including Trump's own director of national intelligence, and all Trump's
everybody on the National Security Council.
Right, exactly. The health and the health secretary, the Homeland, every single department, every single
Mike Pompeo's State Department, the CIA, the list is everybody
was pulling in the opposite direction. So there was this tug of war. And by the way, when Trump decided to convene a presidential commission on the origin of COVID, this was while he was still president. That was also thwarted by essentially his own people. So it was a huge tug of war in 2020 between Trump, who knew where this thing came from, but who wanted to bring accountability, sunshine, all those kinds of things, and everyone else. And lo and behold, Scientific American shows up and says, this Trump guy is dangerous. He cannot be president. Ooh, strange, isn't it? And now 4 years later, the same thing, happens again.
And it's a prestigious name. It's a STEAM publication. But and when they did so at a time, you got to bear in mind that nobody really understood what was going on. We had some hints of what was transpiring, over in Wuhan, but it hadn't really spread. And it just seems like all of these endorsements themselves, it's just a fundamental issue. I think you hit it rightly on the head that there's no accident that it happened in 2020 and there's no accident that it happened now because there was never a need for it before. We talked in a couple episodes ago about the media and the way that they treated Trump during the recent debate with Kamala and the fact that they were serving as guardrails. And the reason they needed to have those guardrails go up is because Trump is really the only outside candidate. The system has always been incredibly effective pre-Trump at weeding out any candidate that wasn't deemed to be the kind of acceptable candidate. In other words, our structure always seemed to put forth two candidates that the establishment behind the scenes was always fine with. We could live with one or the other. We're okay with both. And as a matter of fact, it's probably good for the establishment if there's a little bit of back and forth. The conservatives appear to win, and then the left appears to win, and it's really all kind of the same. And we have this ebb and flow. And Trump was the first one that came forth that was entirely different and was a system disruptor. And that's when we have this establishment reaction that was a protective reaction to protect itself. And we've been living in that reaction for the last 8 years. And we're in the midst of it all again with the current election.
And I think it's stronger this time around, and the objections are more vociferous and so on, because Trump, let's face it, he essentially failed at bringing the sunshine. He sort of opened the gap a bit, and a bit leaked through, but he failed at just having everything on the table. And it wasn't so much a personal failure, but more of an institution, because everything rallied against him. He had all these hoaxes to contend with, the Russia collusion hoax, most of all. They basically tied this guy's hands. And he also had to think about re-election. And then in the re-election year, he had this COVID thing thrown at him. So for all these reasons,
and
it didn't work out. But now, of course, there's a real fear that he learned his lessons in terms of how to deal with the deep state and how to deal with the institutions. He doesn't have a care in the world in terms of having to seek re-election again, in 2028 and so on, because he'd be barred anyway if he gets in. So he has a free hand. He can do whatever he wants, and the fear is that he will. And that goes for, would a President Trump in 2025 also let himself be overruled on the Presidential Commission on COVID Origin? I don't think so. Whereas in 2020, he got himself overruled. Why did he do that? He didn't want to rock the boat. He was told it's an election year. Don't do this, don't do that. And so there was too much of that going on. But all of that wouldn't apply in 2025 and 26 and 27 and 28 and so on. So that's the fear, that he will bring actual transparency, actual declassification. You remember back in 2018, September of 2018, Trump tweeted that he's just going to declassify all this Russiagate stuff. And so many things that we had to find out in subsequent years. Back in 2018, we had no idea that there was a Danchenko, Steele's supposed super source, that they had made everything up. We had no idea that this guy existed. We had no idea that he was on the FBI's payroll, that the FBI was hiding him and so on. Can you imagine if everything had been declassified in 2018? Well, a day after Trump tweeted that out in September 2018, he tweeted out that, he spoke to some people and they asked him not to declassify, so he won't.
Well, anyway, it was more than some people. It was both internal, and it was the UK and I think it was Australia as well that came in.
Yeah, I think he made that part up. I think it was internal. I don't think Australia told him not to declassify. But yeah, no, you're right. He said that. He said it was kind of various foreign governments or whatever. The point is, this would not happen in a second Trump administration. It simply wouldn't happen. Now, would he be extremely successful in bringing sunshine and so on? I don't know. I have my doubts, but certainly the people who have the most to hide would be fearful of that he would not be controllable as he was the first time around. And that there's no question about that. And so we already talked about COVID origin. So let's talk about Dick Cheney here. Why is it just that Liz Cheney hates this guy? No, it's more than that. What was Dick Cheney's role in the Iraq War? There's never been any accountability. But more importantly, we can look that's more of a fuzzy, big question. There's a very specific one to do with the anthrax attack. So after 9/11, shortly after, this idea of like everything is whipped up. And of course, this is when they were trying to impose restrictions on civil liberties and so-called Patriot Act and all that kind of stuff all happened at that time. Well, you had the anthrax attacks. That's never been fully resolved. And Dick Cheney was the guy who was put in charge of this sort of anti-bio warfare stuff. And whom did he choose to run all that? Anthony Fauci. So all this crap about weaponizing viruses, and I use the word weaponize here. I could have just said gain of function. I could have said make more virulent. It doesn't really matter. It's all the same thing. It's just you're using different words to describe the same thing. To do that with the viruses, that all started then. And Fauci was right at the center of it, at the start of it. And it was because of Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney pulled this guy out of a hat. Why Fauci? What's the backstory there? So my feeling as far as Dick Cheney is concerned is that if there were ever a proper effort to declassify all government documents, in particular to do with the anthrax attacks, but more broadly to do with the way that Fauci became the bioweapons czar of the United States without any accountability without any transparency, without anything of any kind, we'd find a lot of very, very, very bad things. And of course, the Cheneys don't want us to find those.
Well, I mean, it's something that we've been talking about this topic broadly for a while now. And, not only was Anthony Fauci kind of, put in charge of these things, but he managed to create this unbelievably powerful fiefdom that was able to exert through the grant process its control over the entirety of the scientific community. And it led to the utter degradation of science, in the fact that they could, literally change and alter the scientific community's opinion almost as a whole. And for anybody who doesn't believe that, well, we saw that demonstrably happen during COVID. And, that was through the grant process, which is something I think should be addressed right out of the gate. I think that's an important thing to have changed. We've also talked about how lab leaks are incredibly common, and the idea that there's some very real questions looking back in history where different things came into place. And I'm talking about things like Ebola, Zika, Lyme disease. There's even questions about HIV, etc. So God only knows what kind of Pandora's box could be pulled out if we were allowed to look into those things. But all of this still cycles back into this protective element of do not disturb the status quo. Don't look behind the curtain. When I think you probably feel the same way, but I know for myself, for all the research that I've done over the years, one of the things that became clear was just how much Trump was actually forced to operate alone and how really isolated he was. It took me a while to accept that there was no good guys. There were no white hats. Everybody was essentially aligned against him. Most recently in the COVID outbreak, as you mentioned, it was really him and Peter Navarro against everybody else. And that example typified itself throughout everything that Trump was doing. And were mistakes made? Should he have released those documents? Absolutely. But we don't know exactly what was going on behind the scenes. I think that the left's greatest fear right now is a sense of projection. In other words, that they view everything through the prism of what would we do if we were in Trump's position. And if we were in Trump's position, we would exact great retribution on those that did all these wrongs. And, you see people, talking heads, going all the time, and there's a common thematic element of Project 2025. It keeps coming up over and over and over again, to the point that it almost has kind of transcended an attack point in my mind. And I think it's something that they're legitimately frightened of. You see, I don't think it's an accident that some of the biggest people crying about this are the people that have been engaging in lawfare and the people that have been engaging in the COVID cover-up, et cetera. That they look at this and they think, if we were in Trump's place, what would we do? And the answer to that question scares the hell out of them. And that is why we are seeing this incredible systemic response, because they're in fear, thinking that this time may in some way, shape, or form be different, or at least that Trump's going to be sort of unbound. There's not going to have the same constraints. He's going to come in with an entirely different level of understanding. When we've already seen 2 assassination attempts within, a handful of days of each other. A month and a half, 2 months, or whatever. I'd be surprised if there's not more.
Yeah, no, unfortunately that's true. Yeah, no, it's Project 2025. People say, well, it's like Trump wants to fire all the people in the federal government and whatever. Look, so let's start with that one. By the way, that would be great. I mean, Elon fired 90% of people at Twitter and the thing ran just fine. So I'm very confident you could fire 90% of the federal government and everything would be just fine. In fact, I'm absolutely certain of that. But let's face it, that's not what they're really concerned about. That's not the real issue, because that's never going to happen. You're going to have you have the unions, you have the courts, you have endless lawfare. Try and fire any one civil servant, just one bureaucrat. That's almost impossible. Now try extrapolate that to trying to fire, millions. It's just simply not going to happen. I completely agree. I think it's the concealment. It's finding out how the system really works, all the cover-ups, all the things that are buried, all the buried skeletons and so on. That's the real concern. That's what motivates people like these COVID cover-up people, Fauci, Scientific American, and so on, as well as, of course, we talked about Dick Cheney and what he's got to cover up. And, we mentioned Gonzalez earlier here. He was a kind of a really weird one for the Democrats to embrace, because, again, he was George W. Bush's attorney general. He was clouded in sort of scandal from day one. And first of all, he's probably not the brightest kind of light. That's, widely kind of acknowledged. Apparently, George W. Bush considered him to be a Supreme Court justice. That would have been an absolute disaster if that had been the case. But okay, let's leave that aside. What was he specifically involved with? Well, he was specifically involved with the waterboarding, with the torture. He signed the torture memos. He's the guy. That's him. And then when this was when he was White House legal counsel, then he became attorney general. And then he was involved with firing a bunch of U.S. attorneys, which, we should all applaud, because, it's the executive who runs the government. The president basically embodies the executive in one person. That's the elected person. If they want to fire someone, that's fine. But of course, at the time, Democrats, the media, made a huge deal of it, that these people were being fired because there was political firings and so on. And anyway, and then Gonzalez had to resign. Why is he now supporting Kamala? I mean, that's kind of just a strange one. It's a really strange kind of wedding, isn't it, between Democrats and that guy who represents literally everything that Democrats purport to hate. And I can't escape the feeling that this is not about, oh, I hate Trump so much, or, this kind of visceral stuff. I think there's something deeper to it. And I don't know exactly what it is, but maybe it's to do with war on terror stuff. Maybe it's to do with other little secrets that are buried somewhere. I don't think it's to do with those fired U.S. attorneys. I think it's got more to do with so-called war on terror or something like that, or other skeletons that might be buried somewhere. I think this is a really important point here. Everyone who's part of this kind of wider deep state, elite establishment, whatever you want to call it, has always lived with this kind of just this confidence that they're not going to be found out. The deep state secret will stay the deep state secret. Secrets, whether it's Democrats, Republicans, doesn't matter. That's going to stay that way, and that's kind of being threatened right now. And that then affects all these individuals in very specific ways, many of which we don't know. Those are the known unknowns, and in some cases, the unknown unknowns. But that to me seems to be the overarching theme of these strange Kamala endorsements, where people don't want certain things to come out. And even though it's unlikely, in my view, that Trump will make them come out or be able to have them come out, at least as a possibility. And they can't take that risk.
It's just been decades and decades of imperviousness that no one is going to be found out. We can operate as we see fit. And what's really going on in my mind is the fact that we're having the labels of Democrat, Republican, DNC, GOP, left, right. Those labels are being ripped off and discarded and thrown away. And it's being shifted into establishment, non-establishment. And, think about it this way, the fact that here we are, how many, years later, how many decades later, and the Kennedy files haven't been released. Why? It's not going to do damage to any one individual. Everybody involved in that is now gone. They're dead. The only damage that it's going to do is to the institutions. And that is what's being protected. And even there's sort of two layers. There's all the people kind of at the surface, most of whom we are aware of, who are probably more reeling from, they don't want to have the gravy train stopped. The amount of money that sloshes around and through Washington and all sorts of aspects that when people realize what people are getting paid for, it's just insane. Lobbying for various governments, doing this or that, completely unethical conduct. But it's so financially rewarding that they can dispense with any concerns about that, and they just take the money. So they don't want the spigot to be turned off. And then there's the second layer, which is the important one, and that's most of the people behind the scenes who are not necessarily the faces. You've highlighted a couple, but largely less seen, and that they don't want to have their actions revealed, which are probably of a grander scale, and the fact that the intelligence community operates with basically any lack of constraint, can do whatever they want. So, that to me is the overarching issue here, is that it's no longer left, right. It's not Democrats. It's not Republicans. It's the institution, the establishment against the anti-establishment. And that's what's going on. It's a circling of the wagons to protect things as they are, because you can't look behind that curtain. And if you expose that, there's far too many ugly things that will come to light. Just think about the fact that just a few years ago, people didn't even realize our own State Department, most people didn't realize, our own State Department, USAID as well, its partner in arms, headed up by Samantha Power right now, are the ones that were funding all of the illegal immigration into the U.S., as destabilizing as that's been. That not only was it just Biden who signed these executive orders and then things kind of took off on their own. No, our State Department and USA was providing billions of dollars to fund up this structure of NGOs that ran their way all the way down into South America, up through Central America, right onto our shores, and then inside our country to send all these illegals equidistantly throughout. That was being funded by our own government.
USAID was funding Daszak and his reckless experiments, and the list is long of all that, and then that was all kept secret. Remember the 15 agencies who all knew about Daszak's
who all knew and said
proposal to create COVID in a lab, the diffuse proposal in 2018. Yet no one spoke up. So it's that pervasive secretiveness, the concealment of everything. And it's a pathology, because it goes so far that they need to conceal things just reflexively, even though they don't need to be concealed. Like you mentioned, the Kennedy files. I bet you if they were released, we're not going to find anything. I bet anything at this point. And, we hopefully in a few years' time, we'll be able to have this conversation, and I'm sure I'll be proven right. But it's not about that anymore. It's simply about just concealing for the sake of concealing, as well as for just in case there might be something. There's an interesting parallel here with what happened with, or what's happening right now with the second Trump shooter, this Ryan Ruth guy. There's a bit of a tussle going on between the state of Florida in terms of jurisdiction over this guy and the federal government. Now, the federal government, why is the federal government so intent on having jurisdiction? Well, maybe the guy is just a lone nut. So what's the point? Well, maybe he's not. And so you need to conceal it. That's what it's about. A lot of people don't know that when President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963 in Dallas, that was a purely Texas matter from a jurisdictional point of view. That had nothing to do with the federal government. That's a murder in Texas. So obviously, the murder needs to be investigated in Texas by Texas authorities. And of course, they get to have the body, and they get to do the autopsy and whatever. And the federal government people on the scene knew that. The Secret Service knew that. Everyone knew that. That's a local law enforcement matter. And so what did they do? They stole the body. They stole Kennedy's body. They brandished weapons and forcibly forced the body out of the hospital, out of Parkland Hospital, and onto the plane and back to DC. And then, of course, they botched the autopsy and so on. Other people might say it wasn't botched, but in my view, it was botched. It doesn't matter. It was one of those where Oswald wasn't even on the radar screen when that happened. This is right after the murder. Why did they do it? In my view, they did it just because what if? What if it turns out that this is some conspiracy? Well, we need to have all the evidence with us so that we can cover it up. And some might say it was a conspiracy, and so that's exactly what happened. And I'm saying, well, it wasn't, but that doesn't matter. It's irrelevant what you think about the Kennedy murder. The fact is that the body was stolen by the federal government and taken out of Texas illegally. That's beyond any doubt. And so you see something similar going on right now in Florida. And unfortunately for the Florida authorities, it's no longer as clear as it was back in 1963, because there are now, how the laws keep expanding and the federal law books just get thicker and thicker and more. Well, now there are federal statutes that cover this. So that's going to be problematic, because you have a real tug of war as to, who gets to investigate. And I fear it's going to be the federal government. But again, the wider point here is, why is the federal government so intent on just seizing these things? It's reflexive, it's pathological. We need to have it. And not every time they do this, it's because of a conspiracy. They just do it every single time. They do it 100% of the time. And then maybe 80% of the time it's a conspiracy, or 70 or whatever, I don't know. But they just do it all the time in case there is something to cover up, because everything is governed by secrecy and just having to conceal everything.
It's been interesting to watch this sort of conflict begin to develop between the states and the federal government. We saw that in Texas when we had Texas basically said, okay, we've had enough of this. We're putting up the National Guard and we're setting up our own barriers on the border. Federal government comes in and tears down those borders, specifically for the intent of allowing more illegal immigration. Texas kind of ultimately sort of won that battle, and Biden backed down. But we've been seeing this sort of disconcertingly. I mean, on the one hand, I'm glad it's happening, that there's pushback, but that's not a good place for our country to be. As far as the reflexive pushback, one of the things that was jumping to mind, it's a small thing, but it's very emblematic of what happens. You and I deal a lot in FOIA documents, and everything that we've always fought with redactions. And, you get these documents that are FOIA'd, and supposedly, things can be redacted if it's something that, is classified information that's going to reveal sources and methods. What bullshit term that is. But, they're able to classify things and therefore redact them. So we get the documents, but it should just be that the salient points are redacted. And instead, we've gotten, I remember you sent out a tweet where the entire document, start to finish, was one long redaction line. We know for a fact that the FBI, they redacted the cost of McCabe's table because they were embarrassed. It was, I believe, a $79,000 table or something like that. And they redacted that because they were embarrassed. And, that's been one of the biggest banes, is trying to get to the bottom of the information. And the fact that the whole FOIA process is completely bastardized because of the government's intent to hide anything wherever they can. And so, they've extended it so far that the FOIA acts become almost kind of meaningless. You can get documents, but they'll be unreadable because the government is trying to hide everything that it possibly can.
The 26 pages of just redacted 100%, that was the Steele interview, the FBI Steele interview. And it was one of those, how we said earlier that oftentimes the concealment is not proof of a conspiracy. It's simply proof of the government's reflexive need to conceal everything just because or just in case. Well, that was one of those, because eventually through John Solomon, we got the actual Steele interview notes. By the way, that was one of the only documents that was ever released under this heading of the binder. Remember the Russiagate binder, which Trump was going to release on his last day in office? And then somehow DOJ got a hold of it, and it was never released. Well, John Solomon got, I think, one or two documents. It might have been just the one, and that was the Steele interview, unredacted or like lightly redacted. Anyway, it turns out, long story short, that they needn't have redacted anything because there was nothing new there. It was just Steele's bullshit. It was just the same crap that he always, talks about. There's nothing. So in that case, the fully redacted didn't really mean, much at all. But of course, there's other documents which were very heavily redacted, like Fauci's secret teleconference documents, which we never got to see officially through FOIA. As you said, the whole process is corrupted. The people in charge of FOIA are as corrupted as the people whom they are trying to cover for. If you got someone working in Fauci's office who's in charge of FOIA, well, you're never going to get anything because they're both working under the same umbrella. That's just unfortunately how it works. It's like the old Romans said, who watches the watchman? And unfortunately, in the case of FOIA, the people who watch the watchman are basically themselves. So
You're entrusting the process to the very people that are incentivized to have that information covered up.
Exactly, which is why we never found out much through these official FOIAs as far as Fauci is concerned. But then eventually Congress managed to get some of these sections unredacted. And even then, they weren't unredacted. Some guy from Congress was allowed to go in a SCIF, the secure compartmental facility, and they just had to memorize very quickly because they were only allowed to look at the piece of paper for like 5 minutes or whatever, and had to rush out and quickly jot it down, whatever they saw. And that was the really juicy stuff. I mean, we found out some really bad stuff there. So the government's reaction is to just hide everything, conceal everything, redact everything. But again, I think it's important to note that this is just reflexive. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's something bad there, but that's just how it works. And in many cases, there is something bad there, but sometimes there isn't. So I just think we shouldn't always jump to that conclusion that immediately is bad. No, the conclusion we should jump to is that the federal government just hides everything, just out of, that's just automatically, that's what they do. And, coming back to Kamala here, all these, as a general system, people want to keep it that way. Just hide everything. They're very happy with that system. And then every, constituent element of the system, and we talked about some of the people here, Fauci and Cheney and so on, they have their own reasons for wanting that. But generally speaking, everyone within that sort of federal government structure wants it to be that way because there's no good having these skeletons come out. And that's the fear that under Trump, that might happen. Again, I'm not very confident that it will, but I certainly acknowledge that it might. Whereas under Kamala, it would never, ever, ever happen, nor would it happen under any presidential candidate in living memory. No, it would not happen with any one of them. Trump is really the first one where, it might happen.
Well, that kind of brings us back to the fundamental underpinnings of the way things are supposed to work in a constitutional republic, and that you've got the government inherently wants to hide things. That's sort of the nature of the beast. The government grows and operates in darkness. And there had always been this supposed tension with the media and government. And the entire job of the press was to try to shine a light onto government, and government was always expected to push back because they were resistant to having sunlight. They didn't want exposure. And we saw a complete dissipation of that. That whole long-term kind of structural relationship has been completely broken, where the media has now migrated over the last 10, 20 years, whatever you want, pick your time frame. It's certainly gotten much worse over the last 10 years, has completely migrated from being an oppositional force to the government to being an assistant force to the government. They now enable the cover-ups. And so therefore it comes back to kind of the citizen journalists, et cetera, trying to do the work to expose these things. And, the government is naturally resistant and using every trick of the trade to do so. And so it's not a very good place to be, and that's one of the reasons why the government it's just allowed to operate unfettered in the shadows, and by its nature, that's exactly what it wants to do. And it seems like the pathways to breaking that down are falling by the wayside, and I'm sure the federal government is very, very happy with that. And the one existential threat to that right now is Trump.
Well, the other one is people like us. But basically the sort of online people who are able to look at these things, who have subject matter expertise in this or that area. I mean, think of COVID. In the old days, there's no way that this would have been uncovered, the COVID origin lie, because the subject matter experts wouldn't have had access to the underlying scientific data because it just wouldn't have been shared, and there was no internet, and you couldn't have gotten anywhere. And it would have been, yeah, I think that the government would have gotten away with it, as they did with so many other things. So I think there is an important point to be made here. It's not just Trump. It's Trump kind of look at the Russia collusion hoax. I mean, who uncovered that? It was just individuals. It was just random
Well,
individuals.
yes, but there's a reason that I said it was just Trump. I'm not trying to discount. I mean, we're both part of that work. I mean, that's what we've been doing for the last 8 years. But yet things have just only gotten worse. And I feel like that we're at a very, very dangerous point. And that if Kamala is to win, I mean, that's kind of the establishment's effort to reassert control over everything. And God only knows where we end up. Whereas you and I are not the upsetting factor here. Trump is the upsetting factor.
No, I completely agree. But it's still, we're coming, things are coming to a head. Things are going to get very interesting, and
Yeah.
not necessarily in a good way. We'll see. Because it's not just Trump, it's also the existence of all these people who are willing and able and have the expertise to crack these cases sort of in collaboration with other random people. I mean, it's a new phenomenon. The idea that a bunch of random people across the country, even across the world, come together in COVID origin. It's across the world. I mean, you had people in India doing huge contributions, people in, all over them, in Germany, Switzerland. There's various places where people contributed greatly. That's a new phenomenon that did not exist in the past. I mean, so in terms of this concealment in the past, I mean, think of the Nixon resignation. That was, Woodward and Bernstein was celebrated as these great, Pulitzer Prize winning journalists, whatever. So what did these guys actually do? They did nothing whatsoever. The deputy FBI director gave them a bunch of information. Well, if the deputy FBI director gives me a folder with a bunch of incriminating information, yeah, great, give me the Pulitzer. But what have I actually done? What have I actually contributed? Nothing whatsoever. So in comparison to what people are doing, individual random people on Twitter are doing these days to what these guys did back then, there is no comparison. These guys didn't do anything. And then, of course, the wider point here is that the fact that they got it from the FBI deputy director. That means they got it from government within. So it was one of those instances where the government did want to reveal a little secret for its own purposes. So it's kind of, it wasn't transparency in any normal sense of the word. It was basically like government infighting that got us there. I don't want to get into, Nixon's culpability and this and that. Without a question, he was part of the cover-up. Without a question, he knew something bad happened. And without a question, he was there when they talked about paying these guys off and so on. There's no evidence he knew about it from beforehand, but there is also no doubt that he knew about it afterwards and was involved with that. And that's what the Mark Felt, the so-called deep throat, the deputy director of the FBI, told. And by the way, Washington Post, right? Woodward and Bernstein. So that in and of itself wasn't great investigative journalism or anything. What it was simply government innuendo playing out, and the Washington Post being a big part of it. But that's changed. Nowadays, you have two pieces in that, spicing it up. You have Trump, who is certainly willing to, I don't know if he's able, but he's certainly willing to reveal stuff and declassify stuff and so on. But then you also have this huge group of kind of just organic, random people who are out there willing to take it further, to analyze it, to do stuff with it. And this is a very dangerous time for everyone, really. For the government, because the secrets might come out, but for everyone else, because the government is constantly pushing back against that. The whole censorship, would that be happening if there wasn't this big group of random individuals who might at any point in time uncover big things?
We just continually see lines being crossed that have never been crossed before. And every time one line is crossed, the next line is crossed, and so on and so on. And all of these lines are being crossed for a single reason, and that is to protect the establishment at all costs from its populace. And basically, we're having a Band-Aid being ripped off, where people are starting to see that the idea of a constitutional republic, is something that is much more of a fiction than they actually thought. And that's an uncomfortable place to be.